The letter came on a cold March morning, the kind where frost clung to the window panes like dust that refused to melt. Elias Ward read it twice, then once more, his rough hands trembling not from cold, but from something heavier. Obligation. He hadn't sent for a bride out of want, but because the preacher in town said no man should face another winter alone. The agency in St. Louis wrote back that a young woman named Clara Milton had agreed to travel west. Healthy, industrious, of moral virtue, and accompanied by 2 younger dependents. Dependents. He thought that meant cousins or hired help. It wasn't until the stagecoach arrived 3 weeks later, creaking up the mountain road in a swirl of pale dust, that he realized dependents meant sisters, 2 of them, both small, both staring at him with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. Clara stepped down first, her dress wrinkled from travel, one shoe scuffed clean through at the toe. Behind her came the girls, one clutching a torn doll, the other gripping a tin cup like a treasure. Elias removed his hat, unsure what to say. "Ma'am," he began, but she cut him short with a tired nod. "Mr. Ward," she said softly, "I'm sorry. They had nowhere else to go." He looked at the letter still folded in his coat pocket, then at the 3 faces before him, hope, fear, and apology tangled together. The driver tossed down a single trunk, then left without looking back, dust swallowing the stage into the canyon's bend. Silence followed, broken only by the wind brushing through pine. Elias cleared his throat. "Cabin's up that way," he said finally. "Ain't much, but it's dry." Clara nodded, lifting the youngest into her arms. The path was narrow, carved between rocks still crusted with snow. Halfway up, the eldest girl stumbled, and Elias lifted her without thinking, surprised by how light she was, like a bundle of air wearing rags. When they reached the cabin, the door creaked open to the smell of cedar smoke and old bread. "It's small," he said, ashamed suddenly of its emptiness. "We've lived in smaller," Clara whispered. She set the girl down by the hearth, and when the child reached for the fire's warmth, Elias realized the truth he hadn't wanted to see. They hadn't come looking for a husband. They'd come looking for mercy. That first night, the cabin felt too small for the weight of 4 souls, and the quiet between them. The fire snapped against the chill, throwing uneven light across rough-hewn walls and faces that had forgotten comfort. Clara sat near the hearth, her sisters huddled against her like fledglings under one wing. Elias moved awkwardly around them, setting tin bowls on the table, pouring hot water from a kettle, doing anything that gave his hands a reason to move. The girls stared at him with wide, wary eyes, unsure if this man with the weathered face and soot-lined palms was safety, or simply another stranger they'd have to learn to fear. Clara broke the silence first. "You live here alone?" Her voice was low, shaped by exhaustion more than curiosity. Elias nodded, pushing a bowl of stew toward her. "4 winters now? You built it yourself?" "Mostly." She looked around, the smooth logs, the small shelf with folded blankets, a single wooden chair worn by habit. "It's strong," she said quietly, and he caught the faintest trace of gratitude hidden beneath the formality. The younger girl, maybe 7, reached for her spoon too fast, spilling broth across the table. Elias handed her a cloth. "No harm done," he said. She froze, waiting for rebuke, but none came. When she finally smiled, it was so brief he almost missed it. After supper, the cabin settled into the kind of silence that comes only in places untouched by town noise. The girls slept near the hearth, curled together beneath a blanket he'd laid out. Clara remained awake, sitting by the window where moonlight spilled faintly over her hands. Elias watched her reflection in the glass. "You got family back east?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore. Fever took my parents. Then debt took the house. The girls are all I have." "And you thought a mountain would fix that?" he asked gently. Her mouth trembled. "I thought maybe kindness might." The words caught him off guard, simple, naked, truer than anything he'd heard in years. He nodded slowly, as if answering a prayer he didn't remember saying. "I ain't much," he said finally, "but you'll be safe here." She looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring whether those words could hold the weight of 3 lives. The wind outside sighed through the pines, brushing against the walls like a blessing. When she finally turned away, her shoulders seemed lighter. The fire dimmed, leaving only 4 shadows on the wall, 3 small, 1 large, stretching together as if they'd already begun learning the shape of home. By the 3rd morning, the mountain began to breathe easier. The snow at the edge of the pines softened into water, trickling toward the valley like the world remembering how to move again. Elias rose before dawn, as always, splitting kindling and feeding the fire. But now there were sounds behind him that hadn't existed in years. Soft footsteps, quiet humming, a child's cough turning into a giggle. Clara had found her rhythm fast, sweeping ashes from the hearth, boiling water for washing, her sleeves rolled past her elbows in calm determination. Her sisters, Ruth and Mary, trailed her everywhere, their laughter cautious but growing stronger each hour. Elias watched from the doorway, unsure what to make of the sudden life filling a space that had been silent too long. When he tried to offer help, Clara smiled faintly and said, "If I can't work, I'll start thinking, and that's always worse." He nodded, pretending to understand, though her words sat in his chest all day. The mountain had given him quiet, but quiet had turned into loneliness. For her, noise meant safety. Motion meant control. That afternoon, he saddled his horse to fetch flour and candles from town. Clara followed him to the yard, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. "You'll come back tonight?" she asked. "Before dark," he said. "Town's close, but gossip travels faster. Folks will know you're here." "Let them," she replied, but her eyes flickered with fear before she caught herself. He noticed. "They won't bother you," he said quietly. "Not while you're under my roof." She opened her mouth to thank him, then stopped, as if the word didn't feel big enough. When he returned that evening, the scent of bread met him at the door. Clara had managed to bake with what little they had, the crust uneven but golden. The girls were seated near the fire, whispering over a handful of marbles he'd carved for them weeks before without knowing why. For the first time, he didn't eat alone. Ruth told a story about a talking rabbit that lived under a fence. Mary interrupted to insist it was a bear instead. Clara laughed then, a real laugh, and Elias nearly forgot to breathe at the sound of it. It wasn't joy, it was relief wearing joy's face. When the girls finally fell asleep, Clara folded her hands around her cup and said softly, "You didn't ask for all this." "Maybe it was time something found me," he answered. Outside, the mountain wind carried a note of warmth. Inside, the old cabin listened to the new sound of life and did not complain. The letter that had brought Clara up the mountain had been written by a preacher, but the men who came asking about her carried no scripture, only suspicion. It was late afternoon when Elias saw them, 2 riders climbing slow through the thawing mud, coats too fine for labor, and eyes that belonged in a courthouse, not the wilderness. He knew the type. Men who measured others by ownership papers. "Stay inside," he told Clara as he stepped onto the porch, hat pulled low. The older of the pair dismounted first, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Mr. Ward," he called, his voice smooth, practiced. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Halverson in Wichita. He's claiming a breach of contract. Seems a woman by the name of Clara Milton disappeared before fulfilling her arrangement." Elias didn't flinch. "Don't know her," he said evenly. "Reckon the mail gets lost plenty out here." The younger man spat into the dirt, glancing toward the cabin window. "Funny, then, that her likeness matches the one peeking out your curtain." Inside, Clara froze, pulling her sisters close. Elias stepped forward, blocking the view. "You said your piece," he growled. "Now ride home." "She owes money," the older man pressed. "Travel fees, clothing, lodging. She ran before the paperwork cleared. That makes her property until paid." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Ain't no such thing as property here." The wind cut through the trees like a warning. The men looked at each other, then back at him. "You're protecting a runaway, Mr. Ward. Law won't smile on that." "Neither will God," Elias replied. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the older man laughed softly. "You can't keep her hidden forever." "I don't plan to," Elias said, voice low. "She's free to walk this mountain same as I am?" His tone left no room for question. The men muttered, swung back into their saddles, and turned their horses down slope. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Elias step inside. Clara stood near the door, her face pale, trembling with something beyond fear. Shame, old and deep. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Men like that never do." "Then we'll make it harder for them to find you," he said simply. "They think they own the ground under their boots. Truth is, the mountain don't take sides. It swallows what don't belong." She sank into the chair, pressing her hands to her face. "I didn't mean for you to get caught in this." "You didn't," he said. "I walked in on my own 2 feet." When she looked up again, her eyes shone in the firelight, wet but fierce. "Why are you helping us?" Elias hesitated, then answered with the quiet honesty of a man who'd stopped hiding behind pride. "Because somebody should have done the same for my wife once." Outside, the last echo of hoofbeats faded down the trail. Inside, the weight of confession settled like warmth instead of guilt. The mountain, indifferent and eternal, kept their secret. 3 days after the riders left, the rain began, a thin, steady drizzle that refused to quit. It soaked the mountain until the ground turned to clay, and the trail down to town washed into a brown river. Elias nailed boards over the draft in the window, while Clara hung clothes near the fire, her sleeves damp, her patience thinner than ever. The girls built a small fort from old quilts and boxes, whispering stories to keep from hearing the wind clawing at the roof. When thunder rolled through the valley, Ruth squeaked and buried her face in Clara's lap. Elias watched quietly from the corner, knife in hand, shaping wood into something small and round. "You carve when you're nervous?" Clara said after a while, her voice barely above the storm. "I carve when I can't fix what's out there," he replied. "Makes me feel like I'm still doing something." She nodded, understanding more than she'd admit. By morning, the rain had turned to sleet, sealing them in. The world outside blurred into white, and for the first time since they'd arrived, none of them spoke about leaving. Elias built shelves from leftover planks. Clara sewed patches into coats that weren't hers, and the girls began to hum while folding laundry, a sound so soft he almost missed it at first. "That tune," he said one evening as the fire burned low. "Your mother's?" Clara smiled faintly. "Our father's. He used to sing it when storms took the harvest. Said if the walls shook but didn't fall, we were blessed. He was right. He died believing he wasn't," she whispered. "Men like him only learned to count blessings when they were gone." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was honest. Elias set the small wooden circle he'd carved on the table. It was a button, roughly shaped like a heart. "For your coat," he said. She traced it with her thumb, the grain still rough. "You make the kind of things that last," she said softly. "Not always," he answered. "Sometimes I just make them again when they break." The fire cracked, a log collapsing into embers. The girls were asleep in the loft, their breathing steady, safe. Outside, water still rushed through the ravine, but it no longer sounded threatening. Just alive. Clara folded her hands and whispered, "I thought coming here was a mistake." Elias looked up. "And now?" She glanced toward the sleeping girls. "Now I think maybe mistakes are how mercy travels." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the storm began, he smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, the wind calmed, as if listening. The thaw came sudden, the kind that split the earth open and filled the streams with noise. Elias had gone out early to check the traps, and Clara was hanging wet blankets near the porch when she saw movement in the trees. A dark coat, a man on foot, too steady for a wanderer. He carried himself with the ease of someone who knew how to follow a trail. Her breath caught, every instinct honed by months of fear flaring at once. "Elias," she called, voice trembling just enough to make him turn. He saw it too. The stranger stopped 10 yards from the clearing, hands raised, no weapon drawn. "I mean no harm," he said, his accent thick with the dust of far-off towns. "My horse broke a leg near the ridge. I was told a Mr. Ward lived here, man who knows how to mend things." Elias didn't lower the axe in his hand. "Depends what needs mendin'." The man smiled thinly. "Just a horse this time, though rumor says you've been mendin' hearts too." Clara froze. He looked at her as he spoke, not unkindly, but with recognition that made her blood run cold. "You've met me before," she said, her voice barely audible. "Wichita," he replied. "You worked the boarding house. My brother handled your fare west." Elias stepped forward. "You part of that business?" The stranger shook his head. "No. I'm the one who told him to let you go. He didn't listen. I'm sorry for what followed." His voice broke a little, genuine in its remorse. The wind carried the sound between them like a fragile thing that might not survive the distance. Elias studied him, the lines of travel and regret written clear across his face. "You got proof?" he asked. The man reached into his coat slowly and pulled out a folded envelope. "A signed notice from the agency. The debt's cleared. No one's looking for her anymore." He held it out, his eyes flicking from Elias to Clara. "I figured she deserved to hear it from someone who means it." Elias lowered the axe but didn't step closer. "You could have sent that by mail." "Iota Road walked in person," the man said simply. He left the paper on a fence post, nodded once, and turned back toward the trees. Clara's knees almost gave out as Elias caught her arm. She pressed her face against his coat, shaking. "He's telling the truth," she whispered. "That's the man who tried to help before it went wrong." Elias tucked the letter into his pocket. "Then let's call it done." "You believe him?" "Doesn't matter," he said gently. "You're free either way." She pulled back to look at him. "You keep saying that word." He met her gaze, steady as stone. "'Cause maybe someday you'll believe it." She smiled through the tears, small but bright, like dawn pushing through storm clouds. Behind them, the stranger disappeared into the pines, his footsteps swallowed by earth that no longer kept count of who had come to take and who had come to give. By late April, the mountain softened into green again, and for the first time in months, the sound inside the cabin was laughter. Not fear, Clara woke early to knead dough on the table, while the girls fetched water from the creek, their shoes splashing through puddles that glistened with the sun's return. Elias worked outside repairing the barn roof, every hammer strike echoing across the valley like a steady heartbeat. When the bread was baking, the air filled with a smell so warm and human that he found himself stopping mid-swing just to breathe it in. He hadn't realized how much scent alone could feel like prayer. Inside, Clara brushed flour from her hands, smiling at how the girls argued over who had shaped the roundest loaf. "Let them fight," she said softly, half to herself. "It sounds like childhood again." When Elias returned, the table was set. 3 small plates, 1 large, and a silence that no longer felt like absence. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," she answered. "We all owe you more than bread." "You don't owe me a thing," he said, pulling out a chair. "I didn't save you." "No," she replied gently, "but you didn't turn away. Sometimes that's the same thing." The meal passed with easy chatter. Mary showed him a drawing she'd made in charcoal, a crooked house with smoke curling from the roof. "That's this place," she said proudly. "You forgot the horse," Ruth teased. "I'll draw him tomorrow," Mary replied, her eyes bright. Elias smiled, tucking the paper into the mantel beam. "That's the best picture this cabin's ever had," he said. When the girls went outside to play, Clara stayed back, wiping crumbs from the table. "They're different here," she said quietly. "They sleep through the night. They laugh without checking the door." "That's what the mountain does," Elias said. "Takes the noise out of hurt." She looked up at him, eyes soft. "And what about you? Does it take yours too?" He hesitated, glancing toward the window where sunlight broke through pine. "Some of it," he said finally. "The rest I reckon I just live beside." She nodded, understanding more than his words could say. When evening came, they all stood outside, the air carrying the scent of pine and baked crust. The girls ran ahead chasing the last light, their laughter rising against the hum of crickets. Clara leaned against the post beside him, watching them with quiet awe. "If this is all we ever have," she said, "it's enough." Elias turned to her, the fading sun catching the lines in his face. "Then maybe that's what makes it sacred." They stayed there until the sky turned violet, the smoke from the chimney curling like a hymn into the cooling air. And for the first time in his memory, Elias Ward felt something that wasn't loneliness or duty. It was peace, plain and undeserved, but real all the same. Peace never lasted long on the mountain. Not because the land took it away, but because people from below always came looking for it. Word had spread in town that Elias Ward, the widower who hadn't been seen at Sunday service in years, was keeping 3 women in his cabin. At first it was only whispers, the kind that slithered between coffee cups and saloon doors, but soon the preacher himself rode up under the guise of checking on a lost lamb. Elias met him at the fence, sleeves rolled, jaw set. "I ain't lost," he said flatly. The preacher shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking toward the window where Clara was sweeping the floor, the girls laughing behind her. "The good folk worry, Mr. Ward," he said. "A man alone with women not his kin. It invites questions." Elias's voice was calm, but solid as oak. "Then let them ask 'em to my face." The preacher tipped his hat, muttered a blessing that sounded more like a warning, and rode off. Inside, Clara stood frozen. "They'll turn this into something ugly," she whispered. "They always do." Elias hung his hat on the wall. "Then we'll keep living the truth till they get tired of the lie." That night, he found her sitting on the porch, the lantern's glow tracing the edge of her face. I didn't mean to bring trouble, she said softly. I thought leaving the world behind meant it would forget us. The world don't forget, he said, lowering himself onto the step beside her. It just waits for new gossip. Let it talk. She looked at him, her eyes searching. How do you stay so calm? He rubbed a thumb against the callus on his palm. Because truth don't need defending. It just needs living. For a long time, they sat without words, the night thick with crickets and pine. The girls slept inside, their breathing steady, their dreams no longer filled with running. When I came here, Clara whispered, I thought you'd ask me to marry you to make it proper. He glanced at her, the faintest smile in his eyes. That ain't mercy, that's paperwork. She laughed softly, the sound trembling through the quiet. Then what do you call this? He looked toward the dark outline of the cabin, the glow of firelight moving behind the curtain. Family, he said, the kind no one gets to sell. The word hung between them like a vow. Somewhere below in the valley, church bells rang faintly through the night, but neither of them moved. For once, Elias didn't feel the need to be understood by anyone else. The mountain had heard the promise, and that was enough. By May, the gossip had grown tired, and the mountain had stopped listening. The trail that once brought suspicion now carried only wind and wildflowers. The girls spent their days down by the creek, picking smooth stones and pretending they were coins from faraway kingdoms, while Clara mended clothes on the porch, humming the same tune her father once sang before everything fell apart. Elias watched them from the field, hat tilted low, the rhythm of the hammer and saw matching the steady calm that had finally settled over his bones. He was building a new shed by then, half for tools, half for the things the girls collected. Every board he nailed felt less like work and more like confession, each strike saying, this stays, this matters, this won't be taken again. When he came in for supper that evening, Clara was setting bowls on the table. Her sleeves rolled, the smell of onions and bread thick in the air. The girls had fallen asleep by the fire, one curled over the other, their hair tangled together like vines. They wore themselves out, she whispered. They think the mountain's playground now. Elias smiled, easing into his chair. It is. Just needed the right laughter to wake it up. Clara sat opposite him, hands folded loosely in her lap. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked. Town, the valley. Maybe finding someplace new? He looked toward the window where twilight painted the peaks in copper. No, he said after a while. Every place I ever left stayed inside me anyway. Might as well build where the echoes already know my name. She nodded, quiet. When we first came, I thought I was saving them, she said. But I think you saved me instead. He met her eyes across the dim light. I didn't save you, Clara. You just stopped apologizing for breathing. The words made her blink hard, a tear slipping down unnoticed. Outside, a faint drizzle began, soft as breath. She rose to close the window, and when she turned back, Elias had placed something small on the table, a folded scrap of paper, edges worn, ink faded. Your letter, he said, the one that brought you here. She touched it carefully, tracing the crease. I thought you burned it. Couldn't, he said. It stopped being paper the day you stepped off that wagon, became proof that sometimes what starts as a mistake ends as a mercy. She smiled through tears, tucking the letter into her apron pocket. Then I'll keep it this time. He nodded. Good. Not as debt, as reminder. Outside, the rain turned silver in the last light, washing the dust from the grass, the air sweet with pine. And in that small cabin halfway up a mountain no one remembered by name, The sound of peace was no longer something fragile. It was something they had built together, nail by nail, breath by breath, until even the wind knew to move quietly around it. Summer came slow that year, shy at first, as if afraid to disturb the peace that had finally taken root. The pines were thick with new needles, and the air shimmered with warmth and memory. The girls ran barefoot now, their laughter scattering through the valley like startled birds, and the cabin, once silent as a grave, had become a living thing. Elias sat by the porch rail, sharpening a hoe that didn't need it, watching as Clara planted the last of the garden rows. Her hair had grown long, tied back with a strip of blue cloth, her hands sure, her movements patient. He thought of the first day she'd arrived. Eyes hollow, coat torn, voice like a prayer that didn't expect to be heard, and marveled at how she stood now, steady, unafraid, part of the land itself. "You missed a row," he teased gently. She smiled without looking up. "You'll fix it after I'm done anyway." "Probably," he said. "You never leave anything half-mended." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "That's what living here does. It teaches you to finish what pain started." The words settled between them like a benediction. He rose, walked to the edge of the field, and looked down at the valley below. Once he'd believed the world ended there. Now he knew it only began where men stopped listening. Behind him, Clara's voice carried softly, calling the girls in for supper. They came running, arms full of wildflowers, faces streaked with sun. Ruth thrust a small bunch toward Elias. "For you," she said. "You built the house that made our mama smile again." He knelt, taking the flowers as if they were something sacred. "Then they're worth more than gold," he murmured. Inside, the table waited with bread and stew, the same meal they'd shared 100 times, but tonight it felt like a feast. As they ate, Clara unfolded the old letter, now smoothed flat and clean. "I thought I'd burn this at last," she said softly. "It's done its work." "You sure?" Elias asked. "Sometimes it's good to remember where the mercy started." She looked at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "It didn't start with this," she said. "It started the moment someone saw us and didn't turn away." He nodded slowly. The fire cracked, throwing gold across their faces. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hymn, no longer a warning but a witness. After supper, the girls fell asleep on the floor, limbs tangled in dreams too light to wake them. Elias stepped onto the porch, the night air cool against his skin. Clara joined him, quiet as always. "Funny," he said, gazing at the stars. "I thought I was the one who built this life." "You did," she said. "You just didn't know it was for 4." He turned to her then, eyes tired but kind. "Guess the mountain knew before I did." She smiled. Maybe the mountain wasn't choosing who to keep. It was choosing who to heal. They stood there in the hush, side by side, until the first light of dawn began to rise over the peaks. And when the wind finally came again, it didn't carry sorrow or gossip or names. It carried laughter, faint but eternal, woven through the pines of a mountain that had kept its promise.